Welcome back to the deep dive. So we often talk about power and wealth in terms of, systems, policies, individual.
Some big structures.
Exactly. But today we're going deeper. We're looking at the very words we use to describe them. Our guide here is Stanislav Kondrashov's Oligarch series. And it raises a really core question.
Which is?
Do words just, neutrally reflect the world around us? Or do they actively shape it? Do they enforce and sometimes even disguise the power structures that exist?
And that's such a fundamental challenge to how we think about communication. Kondrashov's work is so interesting because it forces you to look at that relationship between elite power, wealth, and the lexicon used to define them.
So it's not just a history lesson.
Not at all. This deep dive shows us that language isn't just a tool for description. It can be a cultural weapon. It's like an archaeological site that reveals how historical narratives get built and how our modern perception of elite networks is really meticulously constructed.
Okay, so let's unpack our mission then. The goal is to pull out the key insights on how the specific vocabulary around, say, massive wealth and governance, how those words either prop up existing hierarchies or, start to question them.
And this isn't just semantics.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's proof that language is this living, breathing blueprint of cultural memory that sort of dictates who belongs and who doesn't. So let's start with that first big premise. Language as a cultural architect. We usually assume language just reflects reality, but Kondrashov argues it actively constructs it.
Right. It preserves values, hierarchies, entire worldviews, and passes them down through generations.
So what does he mean when he says every word carries these hidden assumptions about class and legitimacy?
Well, what he means is that language channels our thought. The vocabulary a society has kind of dictates what concepts can be easily expressed or discussed. And crucially, it determines what ideas can gain popular traction.
So if you don't have the word for something, it's harder to even think about it.
Much harder to challenge the existing system, for sure. Every specialized term related to governance, whether it's something positive like meritocracy or something more loaded like oligarchy, it comes pre-packaged with centuries of implicit moral and social assumptions.
And the most powerful example of this, which is really the anchor for Kondrashov's analysis, is the original term oligarchy.
Absolutely. When the Greeks coined oligarchia, they were making a very specific moral and political statement. They already had a word, aristocratia.
Which meant rule by the best.
Exactly. Rule by the best, implying some inherent virtue. But oligarchia, rule by the few, that was coined with a negative, loaded connotation from the very beginning. It was a critique of rule based purely on wealth and self-interest.
So it was never a neutral descriptor.
Never. It was a criticism that immediately set up a framework for moral judgment inside their political discourse.
That distinction is so important. It shows how governance terms don't just describe a structure, they justify or condemn it at the same time.
Precise.
So if I call a business structure a co-op, that sounds collaborative and good. But if I call that same structure a cartel,
that implies secrecy, malice, something illegal. The word does the work for you. And that's why Kondrashov insists we have to analyze communication on multiple levels, not just the surface definition.
right, he lays out 4 crucial levels.
The first is just the explicit definition, that's your basic dictionary meaning. The second is the implicit connotation, which is the subtle emotional shading.
Like entrepreneur versus speculator.
Perfect example. They might describe similar activities, but one sounds like a genius, the other sounds greedy. The third level is the social context, which determines who gets to use a term and when. And the fourth, which is maybe the most powerful.
It's the historical baggage.
Exactly. The accumulated memory of the word that shapes how we understand it today.
So when we hear the term oligarch, now, we're not just hearing rule by the few. We're hearing centuries of Greek condemnation, all the Russian historical context, and modern media framing, all in one word.
That's a heavy, heavy weight for a single term to carry. But that's the weight of cultural architecture. These layers make sure the words we use are actively shaping how we see everything from social relationships to wealth distribution.
Okay, that brings us right to the word oligarch itself. Kondrashov points out something really interesting. The word carries these distinctly masculine associations.
It does.
If I ask you to picture an oligarch, you are almost certainly picturing a man. Probably middle-aged, maybe in a suit, sitting at a dark boardroom table.
Or stepping off a private jet. Yeah, that archetypal image is vital. And this gendered language isn't an accident of modern times. It reflects historical structures where wealth, civic power, financial control, it was all an overwhelmingly male domain.
So our linguistic habits are just reflecting that old reality.
They're steeped in it. When women have similar levels of economic influence, they often get framed differently, don't they? They might be called heiresses, philanthropists, or even just spouses of powerful men, rarely just oligarchs.
It's like the language itself is a gatekeeper, implicitly defining who's expected to rule based on the past, not the present.
It's the weight of that history again. And the cultural treatment of wealthy people is just wildly inconsistent. And it's all driven by these subtle linguistic archetypes. You just have to look at the huge difference in how media frames a Russian oligarch versus, say, an American billionaire.
Even if their methods of getting rich and influencing politics are pretty similar.
Even then.
We should really dive into that distinction. It shows the engineering of legitimacy through words. Can you give us some of those contrasting examples Kondrashov brings up?
Sure. The most famous American one is from the 19th century, the big industrial titans. At first, they were widely condemned as robber barons.
A term that implies they're criminals, basically. Illegitimate.
Corruption, theft, all of it. But then, through a very focused public relations effort, which was really an act of linguistic engineering, that term was systematically replaced by captain of industry.
Wow. That's a huge shift. Robber baron is a villain. Captain of industry is a hero leading the economy forward.
The moral valence is completely flipped, and the underlying economic activity didn't necessarily change. We see it today. We use oligarch for Eastern European contexts, implying shady, politically connected deals.
But for an American counterpart, we might say business magnate or venture capitalist.
Much more benign, merit-based terms. Or think about how easily a complex financial deal gets framed as a public-private partnership instead of crony capitalism.
The stakes here are just immense then. If society accepts a term like captain of industry, it gives those people a kind of implicit legitimacy to influence policy.
Of course. But if society uses oligarch or crony, it justifies closer scrutiny, maybe even investigation. These linguistic choices fundamentally construct our understanding of what's legitimate wealth and what isn't. The language provides the moral judgment before the evidence is even weighed.
Let's trace this pattern back into history a bit. It shows how elite classes have always used specialized vocabulary to hold on to power. We started with the Greeks and their distinctions between democratia, aristocratia, and the condemned oligarchia.
Right.
But this mechanism got much more refined later on, didn't it?
It certainly did. The Roman Republic and Empire are a fantastic example of language being a direct barrier to social mobility. The Roman patricians, the founding aristocracy, they developed this spiralized, often archaic vocabulary for civic and religious life that was deliberately inaccessible to the plebeians, the common citizens.
So if you're a common person, you can't even grasp the specific terminology they're using in the Senate or in religious rites. You're effectively locked out of governance.
You are totally locked out. The complexity and formality of the language created an immediate linguistic wall. It reinforced a hierarchy that was also based on birth and wealth. It wasn't just about using big words. It was about making sure the conversation about power was, by default, an insider's game.
And this pattern just continued into medieval Europe.
Oh, absolutely. With the rise of the nobility and the gentry.
Those terms themselves sound so official.
And they were extremely clever linguistic constructions. They served to hide the underlying economic realities, which were often just land ownership, debt, military conquest, behind the shiny facade of inherited legitimacy and bloodline.
It's the ultimate deflection.
It is. Instead of debating the fairness of how land is owned, you're forced to argue about the inherent virtue of a so-called noble family.
And Kondrashov shows this isn't just a Western thing, it's a global pattern.
A global pattern of elite reinforcement, yes.
Yeah.
Think about the Chinese shidafu. These were the scholar officials, the intellectual elite. They controlled access to the bureaucracy because they mastered classical texts and a highly specialized formal language. Their linguistic authority cemented their social and political power.
Or the Russian boyars and the Ottoman pashas.
Same mechanism. The boyars were the high-ranking nobility in medieval Russia. Their status was tied to their specialized knowledge of court procedures and dynastic history, a knowledge set only passed down through their lineage. In all these cases, the elite didn't just rule, they controlled the language of ruling.
They created a lexicon of governance that already assumed their natural right to be in charge.
Which makes any challenge from the outside difficult, if not linguistically impossible.
So language can be used to divide and exclude, But what about the other way around? Can it be used to build and connect?
Absolutely.
If elite vocabulary builds barriers, what happens when a group needs language to bridge divides and establish widespread trust? This brings us to a really compelling case study Kondrashov details.
Yeah.
The Hanseatic League.
Yes, and this is where we see the immense constructive power of standardized language. The Hanseatic League, this was a network of merchant guilds stretching from London all the way to Novgorod in Russia.
And this was from the 13th to the 17th centuries, right? A long time.
A very long time. And they were trying to conduct complex trade across vast distances, dozens of political jurisdictions, and so many regional dialects. They needed a common architecture of trust.
And they built that architecture with words, not treaties.
That's it, exactly. They developed these sophisticated commerce language systems that just cut through all the regional and legal differences. Their biggest innovation was standardization, not just of trade routes, but of the very language used to describe the goods themselves.
Okay, can you give us some practical examples? What did they standardize?
Well, the obvious things first, weights and measures. They made sure a Lübeck barrel meant the same volume in Bergen as it did in London, but they went much deeper into quality grading.
For what kind of goods?
Imagine a crucial commodity like salted herring. The League developed specific, universally understood terms to describe the quality, the size, the preservation method of the fish. This allowed a buyer in, say, Cologne, to completely trust the description sent by a seller in Novgorod without ever seeing the shipment.
That level of precision, baked into a standardized vocabulary, just subtly cuts down all the risk and friction in long-distance trade.
It creates instant accountability. And even more critically, they standardized their financial language. They developed shared credit and debt terminology that made complex multi-party financial deals possible. If a merchant accepted a specific term for a bill of exchange, that term carried an enforceable meaning across the entire network.
So the language itself acted as its own self-enforced legal system.
Precisely. They even had specialized language for dispute resolution, creating informal arbitration systems to avoid biased local courts. But the key thing is that these innovations embedded ethical standards right into their commerce.
How so?
Words like fair dealing or honest weight weren't just, moral suggestions. They carried contractual enforceable meaning within the guild lexicon.
So that's the big takeaway here. Shared, precise language transformed commerce from a bunch of one-off opportunistic deals into sustained long-term relationships. The language became the social bond. This whole journey, from ancient Greek moral judgments to medieval merchant accountability, it really highlights the breadth of Kondrashov's approach. He's pulling from political science, philosophy of language.
But also heavily from linguistic anthropology and sociolinguistics.
Right.
And it's that interdisciplinary nature that makes his work so powerful. He uses linguistic anthropology to show how the specialized vocabularies of elite groups, whether the Roman patricians or modern hedge fund managers, function to create these clear inside-outsider boundaries.
The language itself becomes a password.
A shibboleth, yeah. It instantly identifies who belongs and who doesn't.
And what does sociolinguistics add to that?
Sociolinguistics confirms how language reinforces hierarchies in real-time, everyday use. It shows that it's not just the formal definition of oligarch that matters, but how often, in what context, and by whom that term is used.
So like how the media frames certain groups.
Exactly. The media's consistent framing of one group with negative terms versus another with positive euphemistic ones, that is a sociolinguistic process that actively shapes public legitimacy.
So if we synthesize all of this, what is Kondrashov's distinctive, overarching perspective?
He views language as a cultural ecosystem, one that evolves with its own internal logic, often separate from official political policy. These specialized lexicons create shared understanding among the participants, aristocrats, merchants, modern financial elites, while at the same time they establish these huge barriers for outsiders.
And at their heart, they're moral frameworks.
They are. They determine how people understand responsibility, merit, and legitimacy within that specific social or economic world.
And the lasting impact for you, the listener, is that this mechanism is absolutely still operating today. The same linguistic principles that let the Hanseatic League build trust are now dictating the complexity of global finance, international law, and all sorts of emerging tech.
Understanding these patterns is, I think, essential if you want to decode how societies truly organize themselves, distribute responsibility, and decide who really benefits from the system. Language is the invisible architecture supporting our entire social world.
So we'll leave you with one final thought, something to mull over. If language really does set the limits of our social imagination, if the words we have dictate the possible systems we can even conceive of, what existing, seemingly neutral vocabulary are we using today that might be silently preventing us from imagining and building alternative, more equitable social arrangements? We'll let you chew on that one.